I'd like your perspective on what you think that we have seen over the past couple of months. And I'm particularly in the back of my head is a piece that Daniel Levy and Tony Karan wrote, and I don't have it in my notes exactly where it was, but I think it may have been The Nation, but it was comparing what Hamas has done in some ways to the Tet Offensive in a very loose way, specifically the idea that Hamas's strategy could be, this is obviously just analysis and speculation, a political strategy. And they're having won this war is less a function of the material implications of it, but more so how it has changed the politics associated with the struggle for Palestinian liberation.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Daniel and Tony's. I think I would favor a different analogy. I would analogize October 7th to the First Intifada. Now, it's different in one very fundamental way, which was that the First Intifada was mostly stone throwing and had a lot of nonviolence. And the October 7th was kind of horrifying attack that killed many, many civilians, including the elderly and the women, and kind of, I think, really deeply immoral. But it was like the First Intifada in this sense. For 20 years, from 1967 until 1987, after Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza and was controlling millions of Palestinians who lacked basic rights, Israel thought it could manage the problem. And then the First Intifada showed it couldn't. And so there had to be a new kind of way of responding to this, which led to the Oslo peace process, which failed to create a Palestinian state. Israel had since about, I would say, really about 2005, which was the end of the Second Intifada. I think Israel had gotten into another mode of thinking it could manage all these people who lacked basic rights. It wasn't offering them a state. It wasn't offering them equality and citizenship in Israel. It was basically going to say, we're going to manage their oppression, and things are going to be relatively quiet for us. They're going to be occasional. There are going to be some rockets lobbed from Gaza. We're going to go and bomb Gaza, and it's going to be hard, and we're going to hold them under blockade, and it's sustainable. And we're going to focus on other things. We're going to make peace with the Saudis. We're going to be a startup nation. We're going to do all these things. What I thought October 7th showed is that that's no longer possible. And then the question of what are the options on the table? There's one option, which is nowhere in Israel political discourse, would be the idea that since you've created one state under Israeli control, you should actually treat everyone equally in that state. But that has no political support among Jewish Israelis. The idea of the Biden administration is that you should revive the idea of a two-state solution. Also, frankly, not very much support among Israelis and maybe not possible. But the third option, which I fear we are seeing to some degree, is the idea that you can essentially start some kind of process of ethnic cleansing in which the Palestinians will be less of a problem because there's simply not as many of them around. And I think there are forces in the Israeli government that would like to do that. And the only reason, frankly, that it's not the main reason it's not been happening in Gaza is the Egyptians so far won't allow it.
Well, I mean, I think that's been stated basically explicitly by the Netanyahu government that they do not believe in the viability of a two-state solution. I've said before, I think the most humane and realistic path forward is one equal state with full political rights for all. But as you say, I mean, that's not even being discussed right now in Israeli society. Some on the Israeli left seem to be saying, like, okay, maybe we can revive a two-state solution. But Netanyahu is publicly saying, oh, no, I am proud to have prevented a Palestinian state, because look at the barbarism that they that is fundamental to their society, I guess. So, yes. I mean, when we're talking about paths forward, the Biden administration seems to think, and they're putting it out there, little breadcrumbs, that Netanyahu getting ousted, which we now know is inevitable once the war, the bombardment of Gaza ends, they see that as a more viable political solution towards peace. But what is your sense, Peter, of the alternates, the other kinds of forces that would come into play if Netanyahu would be out? Because if Benny Gantz just takes control, we're in the same situation we've been in.
Yes, that's exactly right. The Israeli center was even, is really not interested in fundamentally changing the conditions of Palestinians. Maybe it wants to manage the situation in a slightly different way, but there's not a fundamental difference. I think that, the one of the things that has to happen is Palestinians have to be given the space and the opportunity to create a legitimate politics. This has not really been allowed. The most legitimate popular Palestinian leaders like Marwan Barghouti are in jail. There are no elections that are held. And the Mahmoud Abbas doesn't want elections because he's really unpopular and authoritarian. But the U.S. and Israel don't want elections either, because although they like to kick Mahmoud Abbas around a lot, they actually fear that an election could produce some Palestinian leadership they don't like as much, or they can't control as much. I think that the PLO was supposed to be an umbrella movement for all the different political parties. So just like the kind of African National Congress was able to be a kind of capacious in representing a lot of different Black politics in South Africa, that's the role that the PLO was supposed to have. Palestinians have to be allowed to recreate a legitimate PLO and then decide for themselves essentially what the direction of the Palestinian nationalist movement. Now, of course, that's really difficult given what Hamas has done and given the fact that in the West Bank in particular, it's more popular. And that's why I think you've seen some Palestinians talking about some arrangement in which Hamas might be willing to disarm and leave and stop running Gaza in exchange for entering the PLO as a political party, because it's still going to exist. Palestinian Islamism, the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, is going to exist after this war. It's a reality. And so that seems to me, even though it's pretty difficult, that seems to me to beginnings of a way forward.
I mean, way forward, though, on which end? I mean, this is the thing that I find sort of intractable. Like, if we're in, your analogy in terms of like the first Intifada is that it changed the sort of the narrative that existed, and then the second Intifada also changed the narrative. The argument that Levy and Caron had made was that this was perhaps in some way also an attempt by Hamas to sort of disengage from its role as the government in Gaza, and rather to become a force that is fighting sort of untethered from what is happening on the political side. And the U.S. has been talking about Abbas in Gaza, which it seems to be would be a short-lived solution. I mean,
also ask
80,
what they
he's
want.
88. I mean, well, of course. I mean, but I wonder, like, it doesn't seem like there's anyone who, and certainly the Palestinians at this point don't, are dealing with bombardment and attack and death. So they're not thinking about this, but it doesn't seem like there is any player here who has contemplated what is next at all.
Right. Well, look, I don't think that Americans or Israelis can tell Palestinians what their liberation struggle's goal is going to be. For a long time, it was one state they called a secular democratic Palestine. Over the course of the 1970s and 80s, the PLO moved to accepting partition. Now partition has probably become impossible. So Palestinians need to have that conversation. But what I think the critical role for the U.S. is essentially to show Palestinians that if they resist their oppression in a way that conforms to international law and is ethical, that we will support it. Because one of the things that has made Hamas more successful is the fact that the United States has relentlessly defeated and opposed and shut down what I would call ethical Palestinian resistance to oppression. We have, every time the Palestinians have gone to the United Nations or the International Criminal Court, we supposedly are the great defenders of the liberal international order. We want to use the International Criminal Court to punish the Russians. But literally, when the Palestinians try to use these mechanisms that we supposedly believe in, we literally talk about defunding the International Criminal Court. When we say, why don't you produce Palestinian Gandhis? And then when they create a boycott, divestment, sanction, you don't have to agree with every aspect of BDS. But if you basically want to try to criminalize the same method that we celebrated when the civil rights movement did it, when the South Africans did it, then what message are you sending to Palestinians? You are sending the message to Palestinians that the only thing that Israel and the United States recognize is force, that violence is the only language we understand. And in fact, Hamas has repeatedly, and Hezbollah, have repeatedly told Palestinians, you know what? We deliver for you. Those other guys don't. Mahmoud Abbas has essentially even tried a collaborationist strategy. He said, you know what we'll do? We'll work with you to make sure that you can oppress us with no low cost to you in the hopes that we will win your trust so you give us a state. Salam Fayyad was beloved by Israeli and American politicians. And when he left, because he was the master of that strategy, and when he left Palestinian politics, he said, Israel made me, I'm paraphrasing, Israel made me look like a chump because I couldn't stop settlement growth for one day and we were moving further and further away from the state. The Hamas says, you know who's got Palestinian prisoners out of jail, which is a huge issue among Palestinians? We did. Not Mahmoud Abbas. Who got Israel out of southern Lebanon? Hezbollah with their rockets, right? So we can't decide what course Palestinian politics is going to take, but we can send a message to Palestinians about what works. And we have actually been sending exactly the opposite message.
Yeah, I mean, I think Israel, part of their strategy in dividing the Palestinian body politic was to allow Hamas to get away with some stuff that they wouldn't allow Fatah to do in the West Bank, and nurtured and allowed for money to pour in ways that were clearly to create a sort of an interesting battle. They could do the opposite,